A uniformed officer's boot slammed into her leg, sending her crashing to the courtroom floor. Gasps filled the air. She rose slowly, eyes locked on him, and pulled out a gleaming badge. The room froze, because the woman he'd just kicked wasn't a defendant, she was his new police chief. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. The courthouse was alive with a quiet hum that morning, the kind of low murmur that fills the air before something important happens. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long golden stripes across polished wooden benches. The smell of old paper, varnished oak, and brewed coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of rain drifting in from outside. A bailiff stood near the front, his voice carrying over the conversations as he called for order, each syllable sharp enough to cut through the haze of anticipation. Officer Trent Malloy was already there, planted near the defendant's table like a guard dog. He was broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp, his jaw set so tight you could almost hear his teeth grind. His gaze wasn't on the defendant, it wasn't on the judge, it was locked, unmoving, on a black woman seated near the front row of the gallery. She wore a tailored navy suit, her hair pulled back neatly, posture calm but alert. Her presence had a quiet authority to it, the kind that didn't need to announce itself to be felt. That woman was Renee Carter, newly appointed as the city's police chief, though the appointment hadn't been made public yet. She sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, observing the pre-trial hearing that had brought her here. The case on the docket was a misconduct hearing against an officer accused of falsifying evidence, one of many cases she planned to watch personally as part of her first days in the role. But no one in this room, except a select few, knew who she really was. To the rest, she was just another civilian watching from the gallery. Malloy, however, seemed to bristle at her very presence. Maybe it was her composed stillness, maybe it was the subtle confidence that seemed to draw the eyes of people around her without her trying. Whatever it was, his body language told the story. His rigid shoulders, the way his hand rested near his belt as if ready to assert control at the slightest excuse. A faint disturbance stirred from the back rows. A man coughed too loudly, shifting in his seat, and the bailiff moved to quiet him. But Malloy seized the moment like a predator spotting prey. He broke from his post with a deliberate stride, heading straight toward Renee. His boots thudded against the marble floor, each step echoing in the space. "Ma'am, you need to stand up," he said, his tone flat but loud enough for nearby heads to turn. "You're in a restricted area." Renee looked up at him calmly, her voice low but firm. "I'm authorized to be here, officer." His lip curled slightly, and before she could finish her sentence, he cut across her words, raising his voice just enough to draw more attention. "I said stand up." Her eyes narrowed, but she remained seated, her expression unreadable. Around them, the gallery's quiet murmurs shifted to a buzz, sensing something was about to happen. Malloy's stance shifted subtly, weight leaning forward, jaw set like stone. The air between them tightened. Renee didn't flinch, but she could see it in his eyes. This wasn't about a seating rule or a restricted area. This was about power, and the fact that hers wasn't visible yet. "I'll ask one last time," Malloy said, his voice sharper now, drawing the attention of nearly every person in the room. "Stand up." Her reply was measured, deliberate. "Officer, you're out of line." She never finished the sentence. Malloy's hand shot forward, gripping her arm just above the elbow. The sudden pressure made her rise halfway before he shoved her backward. The force wasn't overwhelming, but it was calculated. Enough to make a statement. Enough to show dominance. She staggered, her heel catching on the edge of the wooden bench behind her. And then, without warning, his boot came forward, striking her shin. A sharp jolt of pain shot up her leg, and her balance gave way. Her body lurched sideways, and she collided with the corner of the bench before catching herself against the polished wood. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like a shockwave. The sound of the gavel slamming down cut through the air, the judge's voice booming for order. But the damage was already done. Whispers rose, some filled with disbelief, others with outrage. Renee straightened slowly, her breath controlled, her eyes locked on Malloy. It wasn't fear that stared back at him. It was something colder, sharper. A kind of steady, unyielding recognition that made the muscles in his neck tighten. For a brief flicker, something shifted in his expression, an unease he couldn't mask. The bailiff stepped forward, clearly uncertain whether to intervene. Malloy didn't back away. He loomed there, trying to reclaim control, his chin tilted in defiance. "You think you can just sit wherever you want?" he said, though his voice wasn't quite as steady now. The judge banged the gavel again, calling for both men to stand down, though Malloy seemed to hear only the pounding of his own pulse. Renee's gaze never wavered. Around them, the crowd leaned forward, sensing there was more to this moment than an officer overstepping his authority. Renee's hand drifted toward her coat pocket, her movement unhurried. Malloy's eyes tracked it instinctively, his shoulders squaring as though bracing for another challenge. She took one step forward, the quiet command in her presence pulling the room's focus tighter around them. Malloy didn't know it yet, but the balance of power in this exchange was about to flip, completely and irrevocably. The silence stretched, taut and expectant. Renee's fingers found the familiar edge of the leather case in her pocket. She drew it out slowly, her eyes never leaving Malloy's. The dark leather flipped open with a quiet snap, and a golden badge caught the light streaming through the courthouse windows. "Chief Renee Carter," she said, her voice steady but carrying enough weight to reach the farthest corner of the room. "City Police." The words landed like a dropped stone in still water. The crowd's murmurs turned into sharp inhales, followed by an almost eerie quiet. Malloy's face drained of color so quickly it looked as if the blood had been pulled from him. His jaw worked, but no words came. The judge froze mid-mouth with the gavel in hand, eyes widening as realization set in. The bailiff took an involuntary step back, his gaze darting between Malloy and Renee, unsure of how to proceed now that the hierarchy had just inverted. And from the benches someone whispered, "She's the new chief," and the words traveled like a spark through dry grass, reaching ears and igniting fresh murmurs. Renee didn't break eye contact. "You just assaulted your commanding officer in open court," she said, her tone even but threaded with steel. "And every single person here is a witness." Malloy's breath came shallow now, his earlier bravado stripped bare. He took a half step back, but the room had already shrunk around him. The eyes of the judge, the bailiff, the attorneys, the public, they were all fixed on him, no longer as a figure of authority, but as a man who had just committed the gravest professional mistake of his career. "Chief Carter," the judge said finally, voice measured, "are you injured?" "I'll live," she replied, not looking away from Malloy. But his career won't. The gavel came down once more, a final, sharp punctuation to the moment. In the back row, a spectator's phone camera caught the last few seconds, the badge glinting in the light, and Malloy's stunned face. Renee turned without another word and walked toward the front of the courtroom, her posture unshaken, each step deliberate. Malloy remained rooted to the spot, the reality of his actions settling on him like a weight he couldn't shake. The case that had brought them all here was suddenly irrelevant. This was no longer just a pre-trial hearing. It was the opening act of a reckoning, and every person in the room knew it. The courthouse steps were a wall of sound and flashing lights. As soon as the heavy wooden doors swung open, Renee Carter stepped into a chaos of camera shutters and shouted questions. Microphones lunged forward like spears, reporters calling her name with varying tones. Some respectful, some hungry for a headline. "Chief Carter, was that an assault we just witnessed?" one shouted over the crowd. "How does it feel to be attacked by one of your own officers before your first official day?" another pressed. Renee kept her pace steady as she descended the steps, each heel strike against the stone deliberate, the sound barely audible over the noise. She didn't flinch at the barrage of questions, but her eyes scanned the crowd with the same measured calm she had in the courtroom. "Chief, do you plan to file charges?" a voice demanded from somewhere in the back. She paused briefly at the bottom of the steps, letting the crowd lean in just slightly, expectant. "What happened in there," she said, voice clear and even, "is not about me. It's about the standard we set for the people who wear this badge." Her gaze swept across the cameras, as if making sure her words would be carried intact to every corner of the city. And the standard just changed. The reporters erupted in fresh questions, the words tumbling over each other. "What do you mean by that? Is Malloy being suspended? Was this a setup?" But she didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked toward a waiting black SUV, the driver stepping out to open the door. The cameras followed her until the door closed with a solid click, sealing her away from the frenzy. Across the plaza, on the opposite side of the courthouse, Officer Trent Malloy emerged from a side exit. He was flanked by two colleagues who seemed less like escorts and more like buffers. His expression was tight, his jaw set, though his eyes darted from the ground to the occasional onlooker who stared too long. "Misunderstanding," he muttered to one of the officers beside him, loud enough for a pair of passing courthouse employees to hear. "Blew it way out of proportion. She's making this political." The other officer didn't respond, only tightened his lips in a way that suggested he wasn't convinced. Around them, people in uniform exchanged glances, some sharp, some wary, none entirely neutral. What had just happened in that courtroom was already rippling through the department like a stone dropped in still water. Malloy climbed into a marked cruiser, slamming the door harder than necessary. From the sidewalk, a young woman with a phone recorded the moment, her caption later reading, "This is the guy who kicked our new police chief." The video would be online before he even reached the station. The lobby of police headquarters was unusually quiet when Renee stepped inside. Word of what had happened in the courthouse had traveled faster than any formal announcement ever could. Officers passing through the entrance slowed their steps, some trying to avoid her gaze, others watching her openly, their expressions a mix of curiosity, discomfort, and something sharper. Fear, maybe. She didn't break stride. The clack of her heels on the polished tile echoed off the walls as she walked toward the elevator. A young desk sergeant, clearly unsure whether to salute, stand, or speak, simply froze in place as she passed. She nodded to him once, an acknowledgement without warmth, and continued on. The elevator ride to the top floor was short but heavy with anticipation. When the doors opened, Deputy Commissioner Allen was waiting for her. His face was drawn, as if caught between relief and apprehension. "They're all assembled," he said quietly. The department's main assembly hall was filled with uniformed and plainclothes officers, rows upon rows of them seated in metal chairs, the air thick with murmurs. Renee entered through the side door, her posture impeccable, her presence drawing every eye. Conversations faltered and died until the only sound was the hum of the overhead lights. She stepped up to the podium, resting both hands on the edges as she looked out over the crowd. She let the silence stretch, holding them there, making sure she had every single one of them before she spoke. "Some of you already know me, most of you don't. I'm Chief Renee Carter, and as of this morning, I am your commanding officer." A ripple went through the room. Some surprise, some barely concealed discontent. She didn't flinch. "If you think what happened in the courthouse today was just a mistake, let me correct you. It was a revelation. And I want you to hear this directly from me. We are no longer a department where misconduct hides behind the shield." From the second row, Trent Malloy sat stiff-backed, his eyes fixed on the far wall rather than her. The smirk he'd worn so easily on the street was gone, replaced with something that looked almost like calculation. Renee's gaze swept over him briefly before moving on. "This uniform," she said, lifting the edge of her jacket to reveal her badge, "means responsibility before privilege. It means the law before ego. And anyone who can't live with that should start looking for another job right now." No one moved. No one spoke. The silence felt like a wire stretched to breaking. Renee let the silence hang a beat longer, scanning the room as if memorizing every face. She wasn't here to make them comfortable. She was here to make sure they understood that the era they had been operating in was over. Her voice dropped, slower and more deliberate now. I know some of you think you're untouchable, that no matter what you do, the badge will shield you. I'm here to tell you, those days are gone. She shifted her weight slightly, leaning forward over the podium. Accountability isn't coming, it's here. The words hit like a thrown stone in still water, rippling through the hall. Officers in the back exchanged uneasy glances. A few shifted in their chairs, trying to mask their discomfort. Others looked at her with quiet approval, the ones who had been waiting far too long for someone to clean house. Malloy's jaw tightened, his hands clasped in front of him, knuckles white. He didn't look up, but she could see the muscle in his cheek twitch. She knew exactly what he was thinking, whether he could weather her tenure or if she was going to dismantle everything he'd built his reputation on. She straightened and stepped away from the podium, letting the tension linger in her absence. Dismissed, she said simply and turned toward the exit. No further explanation, no softening words. The room erupted in hushed conversations as soon as she left. Those who respected her move whispered with a kind of cautious optimism. Those who didn't were already strategizing how to undermine her. In the hallway, Alan caught up to her. You just painted a target on your back, he murmured. I know, she replied, her stride never slowing. But it's easier to hit the target when it's standing still. I won't be. She exited the building into the cold afternoon air, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders but not slowing her pace. Inside, she knew Malloy wasn't the only one she'd have to deal with. But he was the one who'd just learned, publicly, that the woman he kicked in court now had the authority to strip him of his badge, and she intended to use it. The memory was sharp, unsoftened by time. Renee could still see the cramped locker room of the precinct, its peeling beige paint and the faint scent of stale coffee mingled with disinfectant. She had been 24, a fresh patrol officer with a clean uniform and unshakable optimism. The older officers had looked at her like she was a novelty, something to be tested, maybe tolerated, but never truly accepted. One afternoon, she'd walked in to find 3 senior officers laughing near the benches. Their laughter quieted when they noticed her, but not enough to mask their smirks. One of them, a young Trent Malloy with hair still thick and a cocky grin that seemed carved into his face, had leaned back and said, "Enjoy the desk job while it lasts, Carter. You're temporary. This place chews people like you up." His tone wasn't a joke, it was a prediction. The others had chuckled, and she remembered the burn in her chest, the impulse to snap back. But she hadn't. She'd simply walked past them, hung her jacket and gone on shift. That was the first lesson she learned. Sometimes, silence in the moment wasn't weakness. It was strategy. The taunts weren't always direct. Sometimes they were wrapped in backhanded compliments. Not bad for a girl, they'd say after a successful call. Or they'd feign surprise when she handled a dangerous suspect without backup. Guess you're stronger than you look. It was exhausting, but she learned to channel it. Every slight became fuel, every underestimation a spark that kept her moving forward. Her early years on the street were anything but easy. She was given the roughest beats, the shifts nobody wanted, the partners who barely spoke to her. There were nights when she patrolled streets so empty the only sound was her own boots on cracked pavement, wondering if she'd made a mistake joining it all. But those nights gave her the grit to outlast the ones who wanted her gone. By her 3rd year, she started making arrests that couldn't be ignored. A string of burglary cases tied to a local gang fell apart under her pressure during interrogations. She broke open a car theft ring that had eluded the department for months. The local paper ran a feature on her, calling her the officer who gets results. Malloy had been there too, older now, but his condescension never softened. He'd pass her in the hallway, eyes flicking over her with that same smirk, as if to say she was still on borrowed time. But the truth was, Renee was already proving him wrong. Her reputation grew, but so did the resistance. By her 7th year, Renee's arrest record and commendations outshone most of her peers. She'd spearheaded community outreach programs that bridged gaps between officers and neighborhoods, long ignored by the department. She brokered truces between rival youth groups, lowered crime rates in high-risk areas, and built relationships that no amount of patrol cars or surveillance could replicate. Yet every time a sergeant's position opened, her name was left off the short list. The justifications varied. "We need someone with more administrative experience," or "it's a competitive field this year," but the pattern was unmistakable. The promotions went to men with fewer cases closed, fewer commendations, and in some cases, disciplinary records that should have disqualified them. One year, she sat in the chief's office after being passed over yet again. The man avoided her eyes as he shuffled papers. "You're doing good work, Carter," he said, his tone almost rehearsed. "But we need stability in leadership. You've got a strong personality, might be polarizing." She'd left without a word, but inside something hardened. Polarizing was just another word for unwilling to play politics, unwilling to accept a status quo that left entire communities unprotected. Malloy's circle remained tight and influential. They dominated the mid-level ranks, shaping policy and culture from within. Their loyalty was to each other, not the badge, and certainly not the public. They mocked her community meetings as soft policing and dismissed her crime reductions as flukes. What stung more was watching capable officers, often women or people of color, get pushed aside in favor of Malloy's allies. It wasn't until a state oversight board began reviewing the department's promotion practices that the tide shifted. The board's investigation uncovered glaring disparities in how candidates were evaluated. Renee's record was impossible to ignore: top arrest numbers, 0 sustained complaints, and a community approval rating unheard of in the city. The board bypassed the usual recommendation process and promoted her directly to lieutenant. When she walked into the precinct wearing her new bars, the room went quiet. Some congratulated her sincerely, others avoided her entirely. Malloy, now a lieutenant himself, didn't speak a word. But his eyes told her he saw this as a personal affront. She knew then that her climb had never just been about skill. It was a fight against an entrenched system determined to hold the line against change. By the time she reached the rank of captain, Renee had become an expert at reading the undercurrents of the department. On the surface, she was a success story. Her name appeared in community newsletters, her face featured in local news interviews about crime reduction and community outreach. At neighborhood block parties, she was greeted with handshakes, hugs, and the kind of respect that couldn't be faked. But behind the precinct doors, she was still walking a tightrope, surrounded by the quiet, calculated resistance of men who had long ruled the department's culture. The old guard didn't simply fade into retirement, they adapted. They moved their influence into different positions, kept their allies in place, and waited patiently for opportunities to remind her that, in their minds, she was still an outsider. They would nod in meetings, smile for photographs, and then undermine her initiatives when she wasn't in the room. Sergeant Dana Lopez, her oldest ally in the department, put it plainly over late-night coffee one evening in the break room. The fluorescent light hummed above them, casting a sterile glow over their tired faces. "Malloy's network is bigger than you think," Dana said, her voice low. "They've got ties in the union, friends on the city council, and more than a few sympathetic ears in the mayor's office. You're not just stepping on toes, Renee. You're walking into a room full of landmines." Other colleagues shared similar warnings. Some were careful not to be seen speaking with her too often. There was always the risk of being marked, of drawing the wrong kind of attention from Malloy's circle. Careers could be destroyed quietly and without explanation. Personnel files could be altered. Performance reviews could turn critical overnight. And in a profession where trust was currency, even the hint of misconduct could end someone's career before they ever had a chance to defend themselves. But Renee wasn't built to back down. She had weathered these games for years, rising through the ranks not because the system welcomed her, but because she forced it to acknowledge her. Every commendation on her wall had been earned twice, once in the field and once in the fight to make sure it was recognized. She knew the unspoken rules they wanted her to follow. They wanted her to be the smiling figure they could point to when asked about diversity, but never the leader who actually shifted the balance of power. One night, long after the station had gone quiet, she stood in her office, looking at the city skyline through the window. The lights of downtown shimmered in the distance, a reminder of both the people she served and the weight of the badge she carried. Her gaze drifted to the framed commendations and photographs lining the wall. Each one told a story of struggle. The sting operation that took down a violent drug ring, the rescue of a kidnapped child, the community program that brought youth crime rates down. None of it had come without a fight, not against the criminals, but against the politics inside the department. She thought of the officers who had left, good men and women who had been pushed out because they asked too many questions, or because they refused to play along with the culture of silence. She thought of the families who had buried their loved ones without ever hearing the truth because the truth was too inconvenient. She thought of the complaints that had disappeared, the witnesses who had been intimidated into silence, the victims who had been told to move on because justice wasn't possible. Her jaw tightened. She whispered into the stillness as if declaring it to the city itself. This won't be symbolic. This will be the storm they never saw coming. In that moment, she knew the path forward wouldn't be clean. It wouldn't be safe, but it would be necessary. The reckoning she envisioned wasn't going to arrive with speeches or press releases. It would come with actions. Strategic, undeniable, and relentless. She would root out corruption piece by piece until there was no dark corner left for it to hide. And when that day came, when the department finally stood in the light, Malloy would be standing in the center of it, stripped of the power he had abused for far too long. Renee began to notice it in the smallest of ways, the kind of changes that were almost invisible unless you were looking for them. A directive she'd signed off on for increased patrol presence in certain high-crime neighborhoods somehow sat in limbo for days before reaching the duty sergeants. An internal review she'd ordered on questionable overtime claims came back incomplete, missing half the records she had specifically requested. Memos she sent to division commanders were misplaced or misfiled without explanation, only to reappear conveniently after the deadlines had passed. On paper, it looked like nothing more than a bureaucratic tangle. But Renee had spent enough time in the system to know when something was being done on purpose. She started to test it, sending 2 identical copies of certain orders, one through the official channels and one slipped quietly to a trusted captain she'd worked with for years. The ones that bypassed the traditional route moved quickly, reaching the officers in the field almost immediately. The ones that went through the usual administrative process seemed to vanish into thin air. She didn't need a formal investigation to know what was happening. This was a silent protest, a calculated slowdown designed to undermine her without ever openly defying her. The real frustration wasn't just the delay, it was what those delays meant for the people in the community. A stalled directive about patrol adjustments in one neighborhood meant another week of unchecked gang activity. A delayed review of evidence protocols meant more time for sloppy handling to go unnoticed. Every missed step, every lost form, wasn't just an inconvenience, it was another chance for justice to slip away. Renee kept her tone measured in meetings, never letting her voice betray the frustration building inside her. She would ask for updates with polite persistence, watching the way certain supervisors exchanged glances before answering. It wasn't all of them. Many officers carried out their duties with professionalism, but the ones who didn't, the ones who had quietly aligned themselves with Malloy, moved like shadows in her periphery. At the end of one particularly long day, she sat at her desk and sifted through the pile of returned memos, each stamped with some vague explanation for its delay. Her pen tapped slowly against the wood as she read. Every signature was a reminder. The fight wasn't going to come in the form of open rebellion. It was going to be death by 1,000 paper cuts, and they were hoping she'd bleed out before she ever made real change. The whispers started in the locker room long before Renee could address them. Officers spoke in low tones when they thought no one was listening, their voices carrying just enough to be overheard by anyone walking past. Words like outsider and political plant floated through the air, laced with resentment. She could tell, from the cadence, the pauses, the occasional laughter, that these weren't random gripes. They were stories, narratives, being passed from one person to the next until they hardened into belief. At the center of those whispers was Trent Malloy. He moved through the department like someone who had taken up the role of a wronged man. In his version of events, he hadn't assaulted his new chief in a courtroom. He had been defending order, stepping in when protocol was being ignored. The kick, he claimed, was exaggerated, an accidental bump, a clumsy movement taken out of context. By the time the third-hand retellings made the rounds, some of the newer recruits had begun to wonder aloud if the whole thing was an overblown political stunt. Renee knew exactly what Malloy was doing. He wasn't just defending himself, he was framing her as the enemy before she could even establish herself in the role. His strategy was simple. Make her look like an interloper, someone more concerned with image than policing, someone who didn't understand the realities of the job. It was a tactic she'd seen before in other departments. Create enough doubt and the leader's authority starts to erode from within. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a public outburst. Instead, she showed up early to every shift briefing, standing at the front of the room while the officers filed in, making eye contact with each one of them. She watched their reactions. The quick nods from those who respected her, the careful avoidance from those in Malloy's orbit. In those brief moments before the day began, she could almost see the fault lines cutting through the department. One afternoon, as she walked past the locker rows, the conversation hushed. She stopped, not turning to face them, and said in an even tone, "If you have something to say it where I can hear it. I don't deal in shadows." Then she kept walking. The silence that followed wasn't agreement, it was caution. They weren't ready to confront her directly, but she had let them know she wasn't oblivious. Still, she knew silence could be as dangerous as open defiance. It was a sign they were recalculating. The undercurrent of resistance inside the department was no longer something Renee merely suspected. It was tangible, creeping into nearly every facet of her work. Paperwork she had reviewed and signed would disappear entirely, only to resurface days later, missing key sections. Requests she'd approved for community patrol initiatives were mysteriously marked as pending review, despite her clear authorization. At first, she considered the possibility of bureaucratic lag, the slow-turning gears of a department not yet accustomed to her leadership. But when she began comparing timestamps, checking logs, and cross-referencing call reports, the pattern became too deliberate to dismiss. Certain units consistently stalled on the community outreach patrols she had made a top priority. Meetings she scheduled with neighborhood watch groups were quietly rescheduled without her consent. The same names appeared again and again. Officers who not only shared shifts but were regulars at the same after-house bar Malloy frequented. The public meeting that evening only confirmed her suspicions. She walked into the community center to a divided crowd, some leaning forward with cautious optimism, others crossing their arms in visible skepticism. It was supposed to be a chance for the department to rebuild trust, to address the damage done by years of mismanagement. Renee sat at the head of the table beside her deputy chief, with a few senior officers seated farther down. The first few questions were civil, focusing on patrol coverage and response times. But the mood shifted when a man in the back, his voice carrying over the murmurs, asked, "Chief, what happens when your own officers decide they don't have to follow your orders?" The room went silent, the air charged. Every set of eyes turned toward her, some curious, some doubtful, a few almost eager to see if she would flinch. Renee didn't hesitate. She straightened, her voice calm but edged with steel. Then they've made a choice between the badge they wear and the oath they swore, and I will hold them to that oath, no matter who they are." There was no applause, only the quiet weight of people recalibrating their opinions. She knew this wasn't about winning a room. It was about sending a signal to both the community and the department. Later that night, back in her office, her deputy chief closed the door softly. "Malloy's got friends, city council members, a judge or two. They've already been making calls. They don't want to see him face discipline. They're talking about overreach and apolitical consequences." Renee leaned back, folding her hands on the desk. "Connections don't change what happened, and they don't make him untouchable." The deputy exhaled slowly, almost like he was weighing whether to say more. "Just be ready. This isn't going to be a clean fight. They'll drag you into the mud if they can." Her expression didn't waver. "They should know by now I don't scare easy." But as the door clicked shut and the room settled into silence, she knew the stakes had just shifted. This wasn't just about one officer's misconduct anymore. This was about a network of loyalty and influence determined to resist her from within, and she intended to meet it head-on, no matter the cost. The first sign that something was about to break came on a gray Tuesday morning. Renee arrived at headquarters to find an envelope sitting squarely in the center of her desk. No name, no department letterhead, just a plain manila folder with a single sheet of paper inside. An incident report, stamped confidential, detailing a use-of-force complaint against Officer Trent Malloy. The date on the report stopped her cold. It was from 3 weeks before the courtroom assault, and the incident described was worse than anything she had heard whispered in the hallways. According to the complaint, Malloy had responded to a call about a disturbance outside a corner store. The disturbance was a 17-year-old boy who'd allegedly mouthed off to the store owner after being accused of shoplifting a soda. Body cam footage reportedly captured Malloy shoving the teenager against a brick wall, forcing his arm up behind his back until the boy screamed in pain. The report claimed Malloy kept applying pressure even after the teen was cuffed and compliant. A witness had shouted for him to stop. Malloy's response, according to the complaint, was a threat to arrest the witness for obstruction. Renee's pulse quickened, but her face remained still. She pressed the intercom button and called in her administrative aide. "Get me the body cam footage for this report," she said evenly. 2 hours later, she was sitting across from the records clerk, who avoided her eyes. "It's not available," the clerk said. "It was misplaced during a server transfer." Renee's voice dropped into a tone that cut through excuses like glass. "Misplaced? Or removed?" The clerk's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. She stood, pushing her chair back slowly. "Contact IT. I want the backup copy pulled from the archive today. No delays, no explanations, just results." By late afternoon, she had her answer, not from IT, but from the evening news. The footage had leaked. Not through her office, not through official channels, but straight to a local news outlet known for sensational headlines. There it was, on screen, Malloy's body cam angle showing him slamming the teen into the wall, the sound of the boy's cries echoing under the grainy audio. Malloy's voice, barking orders that no longer sounded like control but dominance. The news anchor's voiceover framed the incident as part of a pattern of misconduct under Renee's new administration, as though she had created the problem rather than inherited it. The timing was surgical, calculated to make her appear weak, ineffective, or worse, complicit. Her phone lit up with messages before the segment ended. Some from community leaders demanding action, others from officers trying to gauge her next move. And woven between them, like threads of a trap tightening around her, were comments from city council members requesting clarification about the incident. Renee set the phone down. She didn't pace, she didn't raise her voice. She simply began drafting a statement, each word chosen not for damage control, but for war. The next morning, Renee walked into the press briefing room, the rhythmic click of cameras already filling the air. Reporters packed every seat, their faces alight with anticipation. The leaked footage had spread overnight, igniting outrage in the community, but also fueling whispers within the department that her leadership was crumbling. She could feel those whispers pressing against the glass walls of her command, daring her to falter in front of the world. She stood at the podium, her badge catching the glare of the overhead lights. The murmur of voices dimmed, replaced by the expectant silence of people who wanted to see if she would dodge the blow or take it head-on. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady, unshaken. "You've all seen the footage, you've heard the commentary. Some of you have already decided what it means. Let me tell you what it means to me." She paused, letting the stillness stretch, forcing every ear in the room to lean toward her. "It is not an embarrassment to my leadership," she said. "It is proof of why I'm here." A wave of camera flashes burst across the room, capturing her words mid-sentence. "This department has carried patterns of abuse for far too long," she continued. "Incidents like this are not new, they are simply newly visible. We will not bury this under paperwork, we will not hide it behind excuses, and we will not protect the people who bring disgrace to the badge." From the back of the room, a reporter called out, "Chief Carter, will Officer Malloy be suspended?" Her eyes locked onto the voice without hesitation. "Officer Malloy is on administrative leave effective immediately, pending the outcome of an internal investigation. And for clarity, that investigation will not be conducted by this department. It will be handled by an independent oversight body." That statement rippled through the room, the words "independent oversight" like a flare shot into the air. Some reporters scribbled furiously. Others whispered to their colleagues, aware of how rarely such measures were taken in this city. Another question flew. "Do you think the leak was meant to undermine you?" She allowed a faint, humorless smile. "I think the timing speaks for itself, but whoever thought this would weaken me should reconsider. Transparency is not my enemy, it's my weapon." The briefing ended not with murmurs but with the sharp staccato of shouted questions chasing her as she left the room. Outside, a crowd had gathered. Activists holding signs, community members with cell phones raised, recording her every step. Some shouted support, others simply watched, measuring her, deciding if she was the ally they hoped for or just another uniform in a long line of disappointments. Renee didn't wave, didn't linger. She moved through the crowd with the calm of someone who had just shifted the ground beneath her enemies, knowing the aftershocks were only beginning. By the end of the day, the footage was everywhere, on local news, national broadcasts, and streaming endlessly on social media. Clips of Malloy slamming the teenager against the hood of a squad car replayed on a loop, spliced alongside Renee's declaration from the press conference. Hashtags bearing her name trended, some in solidarity, others in derision. Community leaders began speaking out, praising her decisiveness. The city council chamber phones lit up with calls demanding more oversight, more action, more like her. For the first time since stepping into the role, she could feel public opinion swinging toward her. It wasn't universal, and it wasn't without conditions, but it was enough to shift the balance in her favor. But inside the department, the mood was darker. In the squad room, conversations went quiet when she passed. Officers exchanged glances that weren't hostile enough to be open defiance, but weren't neutral either. Memos she'd sent about accountability training now took days to circulate. Reports that once reached her desk within hours were now lost in bureaucratic purgatory. She could almost feel the quiet resistance hardening into something more deliberate. Malloy, though officially on leave, hadn't disappeared. He had friends, vocal ones, in the ranks. Word drifted back to her that he was painting himself as a scapegoat, a casualty of a political stunt by a chief looking to make headlines. She heard that he was calling in favors, whispering into the ears of city council members who'd already been wary of her appointment. Her deputy chief stopped by her office that evening, a thin folder in hand. He dropped it on her desk, his expression unreadable. Anonymous tip. Malloy's been meeting with a few old guard captains off-site. Private dinners, no agendas on record. Renee didn't flinch. "And you're telling me this because..." Because those captains control entire precinct cultures, he said quietly. If they decide to freeze you out, things will get ugly. You can have all the public support you want, but if the rank and file decide they're not following your lead, he let the thought hang. She leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing. Then they'll have to learn the difference between loyalty to a person and loyalty to the law. It was a strong line, but she knew the truth. If the fractures widened too far, even the law might not hold them. That night, as she drove home, her phone buzzed with yet another message from an unknown number. No threats this time, just 6 words. "You don't belong here, Carter." She didn't delete it. She didn't respond. She simply locked the phone, keeping her eyes on the road, the city lights blurring past. In the silence of her car, she made a decision. This fight was no longer about salvaging her leadership. It was about breaking the rot from the inside before it consumed her, and before Malloy's quiet war turned into an open one. Renee knew that brute force inside the department would only deepen the divides. If she wanted lasting control, she needed more than rank. She needed leverage. So, instead of calling another command staff meeting, where her words could be twisted or ignored, she began meeting off the clock and off the record. One evening, in the back room of a community center lit by humming fluorescent lights, she sat down with a half-dozen neighborhood leaders she trusted. They were pastors, small business owners, and youth advocates, people who had no official badge but carried real influence. "I need eyes and ears outside the building," she told them plainly. "I need you to hear what your neighbors are saying about us, about me, about every action we take, and I need you to bring it straight to my desk without going through anyone else." The room was quiet for a moment. Then one of the pastors, a man in his 60s with a slow, deliberate voice, leaned forward. "You're talking about a civilian oversight committee." "That's exactly what I'm talking about," she said. "You'll have direct access to me. You'll be able to question my decisions, challenge my policies, and call me out if I'm wrong. But you'll also see what's going on inside, what no one else sees. And you'll know when someone's feeding you lies." It was a gamble. Inviting civilians to look directly into the department's operations would raise hell among her detractors. But she wasn't building it for them. She was building it for the public, for accountability, and for a shield against the whispers that were growing louder by the day. Within a week, the committee was in place. No press release, no announcement, just a group of respected figures in the community now holding keys, figurative and literal, to the chief's office. Their first reports were blunt. Some residents believed in her fight. Others thought she was just another name in a long line of chiefs who promised change but delivered nothing. A few said the whispers about her being an outsider who didn't belong were coming directly from officers in uniform. She didn't need to guess who they were talking about. The next step was surgical. She quietly signed off on a departmental reshuffling. Malloy's name appeared in the memo with a new assignment. No longer patrolling his familiar beat, where his allies and friends could prop him up. Instead, he was moved to administrative duties in the records division, under direct oversight and without access to the streets. The kind of job every officer dreaded, where hours dragged and the fluorescent lights made you feel the weight of every second. The reaction was swift. The morning the assignment went into effect, she passed Malloy in the hallway. He didn't speak, but the set of his jaw said enough. He knew exactly what she'd done, and she knew he wouldn't take it quietly. It didn't take long for the pressure of his reassignment to boil over. By the second day, Malloy was pacing the break room like a caged animal, his voice carrying down the hallway. A handful of officers sat around the chipped table, pretending to check their phones or sip coffee, but their eyes kept flicking toward him. "She's targeting me," Malloy said, slamming a file folder onto the counter so hard the papers jumped. "She's making an example out of me because I don't bow down." One of the younger officers cleared his throat, glancing at the open door. "Maybe you should keep it down." Malloy's head snapped around. "Why? So she can pretend everyone's happy she's here? She's not here to lead, she's here to punish." His voice rose with every word, and by the time Renee stepped into the doorway, the room had gone dead silent. She didn't speak right away. She let the silence stretch, the weight of her presence pulling everyone's attention toward her. Then she walked in slowly, her gaze fixed on Malloy. "If you were anyone else," she said evenly, "you'd already be gone." The words landed like a hammer. A couple of officers shifted in their chairs, suddenly fascinated by their coffee cups. Malloy's mouth opened, but no words came out. She didn't raise her voice, didn't take a step closer, but her authority filled every inch of the space. "You think this is personal," she continued. "It's not. It's professional. And if you believe you're being singled out, maybe you should ask yourself why." He tried to smirk, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You can't just—" "I can," she cut in sharply, "and I did. Your assignment is effective until further notice. You'll report to the records supervisor at 800 tomorrow, and if you refuse, you'll be on unpaid leave before the end of the day." The hum of the vending machine was the only sound in the room. Malloy's jaw flexed, but he stayed quiet. She turned her attention to the rest of the officers. "This department isn't a club," she said. "It's not a place where you get to pick and choose which rules apply to you. Accountability doesn't start with the people we arrest. It starts in this building." She walked out without waiting for a reply, leaving a trail of unspoken thoughts in her wake. Outside in the hallway, she could still feel the burn of Malloy's glare between her shoulder blades. She knew this confrontation hadn't ended anything. It had simply shifted the fight into the open, and she intended to win it on her terms. By the end of the week, the halls of the precinct had taken on a different sound. Not the usual chatter about shift swaps or weekend plans, but the low, clipped murmur of gossip. Renee caught fragments as she walked past closed doors. Words like reporter, exclusive, and his side floated in the air like smoke. It didn't take much to piece it together. Malloy was talking to someone outside the department, and not just anyone. A journalist known for stirring controversy, the kind who could spin half-truths into front-page outrage. The timing was no coincidence. He wanted to frame himself as the victim before her reforms could gain traction. Renee didn't panic. Instead, she listened. Every whisper was a thread, and the more she pulled, the more connections she saw. Malloy wasn't acting alone. There were still pockets of loyalty to him, officers who clung to the old ways, afraid that her leadership meant the end of their unchecked power. But something else was happening too. Quietly, almost cautiously, a few officers began approaching her in private. It started with a folded note left on her desk. Check the incident log from May 12. Then a late-night phone call from a sergeant she barely knew. "There's a file they never logged. I can get you a copy." Each piece of information told a story. Old complaints buried, footage labeled as lost, witness statements that vanished between patrol reports and the evidence locker. It was a pattern, one that went back years, long before she had taken office. She met with each source individually, making sure they knew the risks and that she valued their courage. "You're not doing this for me," she told them. "You're doing it for the badge you wear." Meanwhile, Malloy's meetings with the journalist became less secretive. Renee caught sight of him in the parking lot, leaning against his car, gesturing animatedly to a man with a recorder in his hand. He spotted her and grinned, a smug challenge in his eyes. She didn't give him the satisfaction of reacting. Instead, she walked past, keys in hand, as if he were no more than a traffic cone in her way. But inside, she was already planning her next move. The evidence her allies were feeding her was more than enough to counter anything Malloy might claim. She just had to time it right. If she moved too soon, she'd look defensive. Too late, and he'd control the narrative. In this war, timing was everything, and Renee had learned long ago that patience was its own weapon. The air in Renee's office felt heavier than usual, as though the walls themselves understood what was about to happen. She had chosen this moment carefully, not at the start of the day when the precinct buzzed with energy, nor at the end when fatigue dulled tempers. Mid-afternoon, when every officer was somewhere between alert and restless, was the perfect time to summon him. When the message reached Malloy, she knew by the delay in his footsteps that he was making her wait. That was his style. Small, petty displays of defiance meant to signal that her authority didn't matter. But eventually the door opened, and he stepped inside, wearing that same thin smile that had carried him through countless disciplinary hearings. "You wanted to see me, Chief?" he said, his tone almost casual, though the slight lift in his eyebrows hinted at mockery. Renee didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached down, opened a drawer, and placed a thick manila file on the desk between them. The weight of it made a soft thud as it landed, but the meaning was louder than any slam. She slid it forward until it touched the edge of his side of the desk. "What's this?" Malloy asked, his grin tightening. "Your career," Renee replied evenly. "Every complaint ever filed against you, every internal affairs note, every witness statement that never saw the light of day." Malloy didn't reach for it. His eyes flicked down, then back up, as though touching the file would acknowledge its power. Renee leaned back, opening the top cover with deliberate care. "Let's walk through it, shall we?" 2009. Excessive force complaint during a routine traffic stop. Dismissed for lack of evidence despite dashcam footage mysteriously disappearing. 2011. Derogatory remarks about a civilian during a noise complaint call, confirmed by 2 other officers. Written warning, no further action. She turned a page, the paper making a crisp sound that seemed to cut the silence in the room. 2014. Failure to file incident report after a suspect was injured in custody. 2016. Body cam turned off during a high-risk arrest, later justified as a technical malfunction. Malloy shifted in his seat. "Is this about dredging up old?" "This," Renee interrupted, her voice firm but calm, "is about a pattern. One that's been ignored, excused, and covered up for more than a decade. And it ends now." Her eyes locked on his. "And then there's last month. The courtroom assault. You kicked your own police chief in front of a judge, attorneys, the press. Do you understand what you've done to this department?" For the first time, Malloy's smile faltered. He tried to recover, leaning back in his chair as if to reclaim the illusion of control. But the way his fingers tapped against his knee betrayed him. Renee closed the file with quiet finality, leaving it between them like a loaded weapon neither could ignore. Malloy let out a slow breath, the kind meant to project patience but edged with irritation. "Chief, with all due respect, you're making this personal. You've been gunning for me since the day you walked through those doors. Everything in that file has been reviewed, cleared, or dismissed. You can't hang old ghosts around my neck just because you don't like me." Renee folded her hands on the desk. "This isn't about liking you, Sergeant. This is about the fact that for years you've operated like the rules were optional, and people let you. That ends under my watch." He leaned forward now, trying to match her posture, his voice low and conspiratorial. "You think you're the first chief to try and clean house? You're not. The ones before you learned that the department runs on trust, not witch hunts. Push too hard, and you lose the locker room. And once you lose the locker room, you lose the city." Renee's eyes didn't waver. "You mistake silence for trust. What you call the locker room is just a circle that protects its own, even when they're wrong. And what you call the city? They're already watching, and they're tired of seeing badges used as shields for bad behavior." Malloy smirked, though it lacked conviction. "You really think the public's on your side? They'll turn on you the second you make a mistake. Then you'll be the one in the file." Renee reached for the file again, flipping to the last section. "I'm not afraid of being in a file, because unlike you, I don't hide from accountability. I've been in this department long enough to know exactly how deep the rot goes. And I also know who's been watering it." She tapped the page in front of her. "This last entry isn't from a decade ago, it's from 4 weeks back, a courtroom full of witnesses, reporters, cameras. And you thought you could walk away from that like all the others. Tell me, Malloy, how did you think that would end?" His jaw tightened. I didn't think. No, Renee cut in. You didn't think, because you've never had to. You've been told you're untouchable for years. I'm here to tell you that era is over. The space between them felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Malloy tried to hold her gaze, but glanced away first, his eyes flicking toward the window as though searching for an escape. You've made your point, he muttered. I'm not making a point, Renee said evenly. I'm making a change. He rose from his chair slowly, the file still untouched on her desk. Without another word, he turned toward the door, but Renee's voice stopped him. Sergeant, she said, and he paused. It became personal. When you thought you could kick me and walk away. Malloy didn't respond. He just kept his back to her, his shoulders rigid, as if holding the words in would keep him from unraveling. The handle of the office door clicked under his hand, and when it swung open, the hallway seemed suddenly too bright, too public. Two officers standing by the copy machine froze mid-conversation, their eyes darting from him to Renee's doorway. They didn't say a word, but the silence said plenty. He walked past them without acknowledging their presence, his boots heavy on the tile. In the reflection of a glass partition, he caught sight of himself, jaw tight, brow furrowed, the confidence he usually carried in every step replaced by something unfamiliar, doubt. Inside the office, Renee didn't move. She let him have the hallway. She knew the most important part of moments like this wasn't the words exchanged in private, but the ones that would never be spoken out loud. The subtle shift in the way people looked at Malloy now, the quiet calculation about what it meant to be on his side. Malloy made it to the locker room, slamming the door behind him. A few officers glanced up from the benches, mid-change, their expressions unreadable. One of his closer allies muttered, "You good?" Malloy sat down hard, elbows on his knees, and didn't answer right away. "She's trying to end me," he finally said, voice low, "and she doesn't care who she takes down in the process." Word traveled fast in the department. By the time Renee left her office and walked toward the operations floor, she could feel the atmosphere shift, quieter than usual. Eyes flicking toward her, then back to their screens. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the realization that she wasn't bluffing. She stopped by the duty sergeant's desk, signing off on a shift adjustment without asking for the usual summary. The sergeant's pen hesitated for a fraction of a second before continuing. Renee didn't miss it. That hesitation told her everything. Malloy's grip was loosening. In the break room, two younger officers whispered over coffee, one of them stealing quick glances toward Malloy's closed locker. "If she's got files on him like she says," the younger one began, and the other cut in, "then maybe it's better not to be in his corner right now." Malloy re-emerged 10 minutes later, moving slower, his eyes scanning the room like he was checking for cracks in the walls. The usual easy banter he carried with him was gone, replaced with a brittle kind of stillness. He didn't look at Renee as she passed, but she could feel his awareness of her like static in the air. When she reached the far end of the hall, she allowed herself the smallest exhale. The confrontation had landed. Not finished, never finished, but the first fracture in his armor was visible. And she knew once cracks started, they had a way of spreading. The report dropped without warning on a Wednesday morning. It arrived as a thick, bound document stamped with the seal of the newly formed Civilian Oversight Committee, its cover page stark and unflinching. Inside, names were listed. Names of officers tied to incidents of misconduct spanning years, maybe decades. At the very top was Malloy. No qualifiers, no hesitation, just his name, followed by a list of dates, cases, and patterns that left little room for interpretation. Renee had given the committee full access to internal affairs files, disciplinary records, and closed case reports. They had taken that access and built something undeniable. The first paragraph alone carried more weight than months of whispered rumors. A clear pattern of excessive force, intimidation of witnesses, and repeated attempts to interfere with investigations into his own conduct. Each point was backed by references, incident numbers, sworn statements, body cam times. The department's email servers lit up as copies of the report circulated. Officers who had been friendly with Malloy opened the PDF in silence, scanning down the page with tightening jaws. It wasn't just old complaints either. Some entries were fresh, weeks old, making it clear that this wasn't about dragging up the past, but confronting the present. By noon, the local news had picked it up. The evening anchors didn't waste time with pleasantries. They went straight to the story, holding up a copy of the report for the camera. This morning, the city's newly formed Civilian Oversight Committee released a comprehensive review of officer misconduct, the anchor began. And topping the list is Officer Daniel Malloy. The footage rolled next grainy. Slow-motion replay of that moment in the courtroom when Malloy's boot connected with Renee's side. The gasp from the crowd in the background played clearly, followed by the abrupt scramble of people reacting. It wasn't sensationalized, it didn't need to be. The facts and the images spoke for themselves. Then came the graphics. Side-by-side shots of Malloy in uniform, his commendations from years past, contrasted against bullet points from his disciplinary record. Multiple sustained complaints of excessive force, documented intimidation of fellow officers, improper handling of evidence. Each bullet point was backed by a date and case reference that viewers could look up for themselves. In living rooms across the city, people sat forward in their chairs. This wasn't gossip, this was proof, delivered with the precision of a closing argument. And it was just the beginning. Within an hour of the broadcast, the first protesters began gathering outside police headquarters. At first, it was a handful, community activists who had been calling for accountability for years. Then more came. Students with handmade signs, parents with strollers, retired officers who had seen too much and stayed quiet too long. The air outside the building took on a charge, the kind that meant something irreversible had started. Inside, Malloy watched from the breakroom TV, his face still as stone. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one controlling the narrative. By mid-afternoon, the sidewalk in front of headquarters was no longer a sidewalk, it was a stage. The crowd had swelled from dozens to hundreds, spilling into the street and forcing traffic to reroute. Chants rose and fell in waves, their rhythm steady and unrelenting. "No more cover-ups," they shouted. "Justice for all." Hand-painted signs bobbed above the sea of faces. "Clean the badge, accountability now," and one that simply read, "We saw the kid." Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Some officers stood at the windows, looking down with crossed arms and tight mouths. Others avoided the glass entirely, unwilling to meet the eyes of the people they swore to protect. Renee stood in her office, her blinds half drawn, watching the movement below. This wasn't just about Malloy anymore. This was about the department's soul. Her deputy chief entered quietly. "They want to hear from you," he said, nodding toward the crowd. "If you don't go out there, they'll think you're hiding. If you do, well, you know the risk." She didn't hesitate. "Then I go." Minutes later, Renee stepped out the front doors, flanked by two plainclothes security officers who kept a respectful distance. The chant faltered, then died into a hush as the crowd recognized her. For a moment, it was so quiet she could hear the faint hum of the news cameras clicking on. She stepped up to the portable microphone stand one of the organizers had placed at the front. The metal was warm from the sun. She looked out over the faces, angry, hopeful, wounded, determined. "I've seen this department from the inside for decades," she began, her voice steady but carrying. "I've seen the good, the brave, the selfless, and I've seen the rot." The crowd leaned in. "Some people will tell you that exposing misconduct is an attack on law enforcement. They're wrong. This," she held up a copy of the report, "isn't an attack. It's a step toward healing. Because justice is not revenge, it's restoration. And it starts here, today, with the truth in daylight." A cheer went up, loud and sustained. She let it ride for a few seconds before raising her hand to quiet them. "I can't promise this will be quick, and I can't promise it will be easy. But I can promise you that no one, no matter their rank, no matter their connections, will be above the law in this department again." Somewhere near the front, a man in his 50s, wearing a faded police academy cap, lifted it off his head and held it to his chest. The gesture was small, but Renee saw it. Others did too. The crowd erupted again, this time not just with cheers but with a sense of momentum. The line had been drawn, and everyone knew it. The ripples from Renee's speech spread fast. Within an hour, clips of her words were already making the rounds on local news and social media. The footage showed her standing in the sunlight, the report in her hand, speaking with a calm authority that cut through the usual noise. For many watching, it was the first time they'd seen a police chief address misconduct without deflection or excuses. Inside the department, however, the temperature shifted sharply. Officers who had once hovered near Malloy in the hallways now gave him space. Some greeted him with perfunctory nods, their eyes sliding away as quickly as they met his. Others didn't greet him at all. In the break room, the usual cluster around his table had thinned to one or two diehards, both of whom avoided looking at the headlines flashing across the wall-mount television. At first, Malloy brushed it off. "They're just spooked by the cameras," he muttered to himself. But by late afternoon it became clear this was more than nerves. A sergeant who'd been one of his staunchest defenders walked into his office, closed the door, and told him plainly, "I can't be tied to this. My name's in that report. I've got kids to think about." Then the sergeant left without waiting for a response. Malloy sat at his desk, staring at the empty doorway. One by one, the strands of his influence were fraying. The people who had once laughed at his crude jokes, backed his version of events in reports, or quietly buried inconvenient paperwork, were now thinking about their own survival. He could feel it, the slow but steady retreat of loyalty. In the evening, another blow landed. A city council member who had previously called Renee's leadership a political stunt went on record with a statement supporting the Oversight Committee's findings. The statement didn't name Malloy directly, but it didn't have to. Everyone knew. By nightfall, the protests outside headquarters had turned into a candlelight vigil. The chants had quieted, replaced by murmured conversations and the soft flicker of flames. On the other side of the glass, Malloy stood in the dimly lit hallway, watching. The crowd didn't see him. He told himself it didn't matter, but something about their calm, their persistence, unnerved him more than the shouting ever had. Upstairs, Renee was in her office, reviewing the next day's agenda. She knew this was the tipping point, not the end of the fight, but the moment when momentum was fully on her side. Malloy was still in uniform, still on the payroll, but his shield was gone. And she also knew that when a man like him feels the walls closing in, the most dangerous moves come next. The call came early, before sunrise. Malloy had barely slept, tossing between half-formed plans to fight back, and the cold realization that his allies were gone. The voice on the other end was curt, almost formal. "Union leadership has met. Given the findings in the Oversight Committee report and the pending disciplinary proceedings, we are withdrawing legal support." There was no offer of explanation beyond that. "No, sorry, Jim, or we'll see what we can do." Just a flat severance of the shield he had counted on for decades. For a moment he didn't respond. He simply sat there at the edge of his bed, phone pressed to his ear, listening to the low static of the line. The union rep waited, then repeated himself, slower this time, as if speaking to someone in shock. Malloy finally muttered a clipped, "Understood," and hung up. He stared at the dark screen in his hand, thinking of the years he had paid his dues, attended fundraisers, and defended other officers in front of this same leadership. It was loyalty until it wasn't. By mid-morning, the news was public. Local media outlets ran with the headline, "Police Union Withdraws Support for Malloy Amid Misconduct Probe." The words were followed by his photo, not the crisp headshot from his personnel file, but a candid one from a past press conference. Jaw clenched, eyes narrow, caught mid-blink. It was the kind of picture that told viewers exactly how they should feel about him without saying a word. Inside headquarters, the atmosphere toward him had shifted from wary distance to open avoidance. Conversations stopped when he walked by. Doors that used to be left half open for him were now firmly shut. The quiet hum of activity in the hallways seemed to get louder in his absence, as if the building itself was moving on without him. Across town, Renee was already in a closed-door meeting with 2 city council members. Both had been on Malloy's call list for years, names he'd dropped at banquets, people who had owed him small favors. But today, they sat across from Renee, expressing their public support for her reform agenda. They were measured in their words, careful not to overcommit, but their intent was clear. One of them leaned forward and said, "It's time we show the public we're united in moving forward." Malloy's name was never mentioned, but his absence in the conversation was loud enough to fill the room. When Renee left the meeting, reporters were waiting at the bottom of the steps. Questions flew about the union's decision, the council's shift in stance, and whether Malloy's termination was imminent. She gave no definitive answer, but her calm, deliberate tone suggested the process was already in motion. "This department will not compromise its integrity for anyone," she said, her eyes steady on the camera. "That's the beginning and the end of it." For Malloy, the day had barely started, but the ground beneath him was already giving way. The summons to appear before the disciplinary board arrived the next day, formal, impersonal, and impossible to ignore. Malloy knew what it meant before he even broke the seal on the envelope. The hearing would be public, open to media, and scheduled for the end of the week. In his years on the force, he had seen others endure this process, and it rarely ended in anything short of a career death sentence. On the morning of the hearing, the lobby outside the boardroom was crowded. Cameras lined the hallway, their operators murmuring in low voices as they adjusted focus. Activists held signs just far enough from the entry to avoid removal by security. The words on those boards weren't subtle. Calls for accountability, demands for removal, some bearing the freeze frame of him mid-kick in the courtroom. Malloy kept his eyes forward as he entered, jaws set, but the sting of recognition from the crowd was inescapable. Inside, the air was thick with formality. The panel sat at a long table, folders stacked neatly in front of them. To their right, a court reporter prepared her equipment. On the opposite side, an empty chair waited for him, deliberately placed so that he would have to walk the length of the room under every eye in attendance. Renee was there too, seated off to the side, her expression unreadable, but her attention fixed entirely on the proceedings. The hearing began with procedural statements. Charges read aloud, each one hitting like a slow, measured hammer. Excessive force, abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming of an officer. Then the cases began, one by one. The first witness was a young man, barely in his 20s. He spoke of a traffic stop that had escalated without cause, of words twisted and actions exaggerated in Malloy's report. His voice trembled, but his account was steady. Next came a mother, describing how her teenage son had been slammed against a squad car and accused of resisting when he'd done nothing but ask why he was being detained. She didn't raise her voice, but her grief carried more weight than any shout could. And then there was the footage, silent, grainy body cam clips projected on the wall. The panel leaned forward as they watched Malloy shove the teenager, the camera shaking with the force. No sound was needed. The movement alone told the story. When it ended, the room was silent except for the faint whir of the projector cooling down. Malloy sat rigid in his chair, hands clasped tightly in front of him. He could feel the shift in the room, the solidifying of opinion against him. Every face on the panel had hardened, the patience in their expressions replaced by something colder, more final. It wasn't just his actions on trial, it was the culture that had shielded him for so long, and in this moment, that shield had been stripped away. When the final witness stepped down, the board recessed for deliberation. Malloy stayed seated, staring at the tabletop, jaw working as though he might grind his teeth into dust. Across the aisle, Renee didn't look away from him. She didn't need to speak. The stillness in her presence was enough to remind him of the shift in power. The break was short. The panel returned, expressions neutral, folders in hand. The chairperson cleared his throat and began reading the decision. The words were formal, clipped, designed to leave no room for ambiguity. The findings? Sustained on all counts. The recommendation? Immediate termination, effective upon the conclusion of the session. Malloy's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he pushed back. He didn't wait for the rest of the statement. His hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles blanched, and for a moment it looked like he might speak, might throw one last challenge into the room. But whatever words had been forming behind his teeth stayed there. He turned, shoulders tight, and began walking toward the exit. Reporters surged toward the doorway, microphones thrust forward, questions flew about the ruling, about his past, about the footage, but he didn't slow. His face was a mask, and the only sound he made was the uneven rhythm of his boots on the polished floor. He pushed through the double doors, and the noise from the hallway hit like a wall. Protest chants, camera shutters, the low buzz of 100 conversations feeding on his disgrace. Upstairs, in her office, Renee stood at the wide window that overlooked the front steps of the building. She watched as the doors swung open and Malloy emerged into the waiting crowd. The chants grew louder, a tide of sound pressing in on him from every direction. He didn't stop, didn't glance at the signs or the cameras. His stride was fast, almost defiant, but it lacked the swagger that had once defined him. To anyone watching closely, the set of his shoulders told the truth. This wasn't defiance, it was retreat. Renee's reflection in the glass was faint, but she could see the steadiness in her own stance. This was the moment so many had doubted would come, the moment when a man who had treated power like a private weapon was forced to lay it down. Yet she felt no triumph in the sight. It wasn't about him. It was about the space his absence would create, the possibility that maybe now the department could start to become what it should have been all along. Malloy reached the far edge of the crowd, disappearing into the blur of traffic and pedestrians. Renee let out a slow breath and turned away from the window. There was still work to do. Removing him was only the first step. Months had passed since Malloy walked out of the building for the last time, but the ripples of his departure still moved through the department. Renee had spent those months in constant motion, not in sweeping gestures for the cameras, but in deliberate, steady work that reshaped the foundation beneath her. What had once been a culture of silence and survival had begun to turn toward openness and accountability. Mandatory training sessions were no longer thinly disguised lectures to check off a box. They were interactive, often uncomfortable conversations where officers sat across from community members and heard stories that didn't make it into official reports. The sessions were held in plain meeting rooms, not the grand council chambers, and that made a difference. There was no stage to hide behind, no microphone to filter the tension in someone's voice. People spoke plainly. Some officers resisted at first, their arms crossed, eyes narrowed, but even they couldn't escape the gravity of hearing a mother describe what it felt like to see her son stopped and searched without cause. Transparency protocols were next. Renee ordered that disciplinary records for confirmed misconduct be made accessible not just to internal investigators, but to the Civilian Oversight Committee. It was a decision that had raised eyebrows even among her allies, but she didn't flinch. She wanted the public to see not only when the department got it right, but also when it stumbled, and how it corrected those stumbles. Reports were posted quarterly. For the first time, the community could trace patterns, spot improvements, and hold leadership accountable without having to fight for scraps of information. Partnerships began to form in places that had once been hostile ground. Community leaders who had kept their distance now returned her calls. Ministers invited her to speak at evening gatherings in church basements. Neighborhood watch groups that had once viewed the police as adversaries now met with lieutenants to coordinate safety efforts. The shift wasn't about trust restored overnight. It was about the slow, careful weaving of new threads into a torn fabric. Inside the department, the tone was different. Officers began to check each other in subtle ways, knowing that a casual dismissal of protocol could no longer be buried. Some older veterans left, unwilling to adapt, but new recruits filled their places. Young men and women who had joined because they wanted to do the job the right way. Renee made a point of meeting each one personally, even if only for 5 minutes, looking them in the eye and telling them, "The badge doesn't make you untouchable, it makes you accountable." It was far from perfect. Mistakes still happened, disagreements still flared, but the reflex to circle the wagons and bury the truth had weakened. And in its place was the beginning of something that could last. Renee knew the changes were fragile, but they were real, and they were worth protecting. It was a quiet Friday morning when Renee finally allowed herself to return to the courtroom. She hadn't stepped foot inside since the day Malloy's boot caught her in the side and sent her crashing to the floor. For months, she had avoided even passing by the doors, telling herself she was too busy, that there was more important work to do. But now, with the department's reforms taking root and the chaos of Malloy's fall behind her, she felt ready. The building seemed calmer than she remembered, the echo of footsteps in the marble hallway softer, less menacing. Sunlight spilled through the high windows, painting gold rectangles on the polished floor. She paused at the double doors, resting her hand on the cool brass handle. Her heart didn't race this time. There was no knot in her stomach. She pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The courtroom was empty, the air still. She walked slowly down the center aisle, each step deliberate, until she reached the spot where it had happened. She stood there, eyes fixed on the grain of the wood beneath her feet. That day had been chaos, raised voices, a flash of movement, the sharp burst of pain. But now, standing in the same place months later, she felt only a faint ache, a memory softened by distance. She let herself smile, just slightly. This was no longer the place where she had fallen. It was the place where she had refused to stay down. Every battle she had fought since, every late-night meeting, every confrontation, every risk had started here. The courtroom had once been a symbol of humiliation, but now it was the beginning of her reclamation. The door at the back of the room opened, and a familiar voice called her name. It was one of the community leaders she had worked closely with over the past months, a tall man with kind eyes who had been a relentless advocate for change. He crossed the room to stand beside her, looking around as if seeing the space for the first time. "Hard to believe this is where it all started," he said softly. Renee nodded. "It started here, but it didn't end here." He studied her for a moment, then said, "You could have walked away. No one would have blamed you." She met his gaze. "That's exactly why I couldn't." They stood there together for a few more moments, the silence between them carrying the weight of everything that had happened. Then he reached out and shook her hand, not in formality, but in gratitude. On behalf of everyone who's been waiting for someone to stand up, he said, "Thank you." Her smile widened. It wasn't victory she felt. It was something steadier, deeper. She had earned her place here, and no one could take that from her again. Later that afternoon, Renee stepped outside into the crisp air, the courthouse doors closing behind her. The city's skyline stretched out in the distance, sharp against a pale blue sky. From where she stood on the broad granite steps, she could see the slow pulse of traffic, the swirl of people going about their day, and somewhere in that movement, the subtle signs of a city beginning to heal. Her shoes clicked softly against the stone as she began her descent. She didn't rush. Each step felt intentional, grounded, as though she was walking not away from something, but toward it. She passed a small group gathered at the base of the steps, community leaders, officers who had stood by her, residents who had once been skeptical but now nodded in greeting. There was no grand announcement, no choreographed event, just the quiet acknowledgement of shared effort. One of the younger officers, someone she had mentored over the last year, stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, "things feel different now." She stopped just long enough to meet his eyes. That's because we decided they would." The group parted slightly and she kept walking. Somewhere off to the side, applause began. Not loud, not orchestrated, but real. It grew as she moved forward, rippling through the crowd like a slow wave. She didn't look around to find its source. She didn't need to. At the bottom of the steps, she paused for a moment, looking back at the courthouse. For years, it had been a fortress, intimidating, impenetrable, a place where too often justice had been bent to serve the powerful. Now, it felt different. Not perfect, not beyond the reach of failure, but better. She had forced it to open its doors wider, to let in more light. A reporter's voice called out from somewhere in the crowd, asking her what had changed her the most through all of this. She thought about it for a moment, the noise around her fading until all she could hear was her own voice in her head. Finally, she answered. "Power doesn't change you," she said. "It shows you who you always were." There were no follow-up questions, no rush of microphones in her face, just the sound of her own words settling in the air, carried by the breeze. She turned back toward the street, the afternoon sun casting her shadow long across the pavement. She walked on, her pace steady, her shoulders relaxed. Whatever battles were ahead, she was ready. And as the sound of applause followed her down the sidewalk, Renee knew that this moment wasn't just an ending. It was the start of a different chapter. Not just for her, but for everyone who had been watching, waiting and hoping.